So this is the interview with Amy Beashel for the Lish on the topic of writing believable characters. Um, I'm committee member Tia Weldon, and I'm also with Tara Kennedy. The first question is, what do you consider important when creating characters?
So there's lots of things that are really important when making characters. I'd say the first one is probably whose story is it that you want to tell, and really importantly, whether you have a right to tell that story. So just being mindful of your own situation, your own privilege, your own bias. What is it about the story that makes it interesting, and whether it's your story to tell, really. And it's really important to have a diverse cast of characters, but within that being mindful of how you're representing them. And so as a middle-aged white woman, probably my main characters are always going to be white. I white YA, so my characters aren't middle-aged. But yeah, just be really mindful of my own situation and try not to too far out of that. But that's not to say you have to experience everything that your characters are going through. Just be careful not to exploit somebody else's story for your own benefit. And then in creating the character, I'd say one of the most important things that you need your character to be is empathetic. And so thinking about what it is about your characters that readers are going to be able to empathise with. And again, that doesn't mean that your readers need to have gone through exactly what your characters are going through, but they will need to be able to connect with them in some way. And so, for example, in The Sky Is Mine, Izzy's main driver is that she wants to be heard. She doesn't feel listened to. And while her circumstances are quite extreme, so she's her situation at home, her mum's in an abusive relationship and is being gaslighted. I never know whether to say gaslighted or gaslit. She's being gaslighted by her husband, and so Izzy's in a domestic environment which is very oppressive, and she's not really able to speak up at home. And then at college, she's being manipulated by this guy Jacob, who's got photos of her, so she doesn't feel able to speak up there. So her driver is she wants to be heard. And I think that's something, although readers might not have been through that experience specifically, we've all been in situations where we don't feel listened to. And so that's where I think Izzy's empathy comes in. So I think it's really important to think about what it is that might make your character empathetic. So think about the universal feelings that we've all had, no matter our circumstances. So they might be loss or betrayal, grief, self-doubt. So really focusing on those. So no matter what your experience, those gut feelings that we've all been through. I think if you can really nail those, then hopefully your reader will be able to connect with your characters, no matter how extreme their circumstances might be.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Tara, would you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, the whole thing about writing about like what you know about like how you'd only write when you write white people is very interesting, because I usually go out of my comfort zone to write about people of different ethnicities and stuff, but it's interesting, to stick to what you know, which I think is very good advice.
I think it's for your main character. I try and write, I really want a diverse group of characters and for the book to be representative of society as a whole, but I don't think I've got the right to tell a black person's story, for example. So I would never have a black main character, I don't think. Diversity, but within the boundaries of your main character probably has to be much more like you than your other characters.
So what are the do's and don'ts of creating characters in your opinion?
Okay, so do give them flaws or don't make them perfect, I think is really important. I think perfection can be, especially for your main character, because we want our characters to be likable, and we were talking about making characters empathetic, it can be really tempting to make your main characters too perfect, because we're worried if they do things wrong, then the reader's just going to be put right off them. But perfection is really boring, and perfect characters don't make for interesting reading at all. And also it's just not very realistic. And so I think it can be quite alienating if a character feels too polished and too perfect, and their response to everything is kind of textbook and they're too nice. And so when you're thinking about their flaws, it's really important to think about why they have those flaws. So what's happened in their past that's made them behave the way that they're behaving now. So yeah, give them some bad points. Yeah, make them a bit more interesting by giving them some dirt. And just as important, I think, is giving them agency. So it's not very exciting for a reader to read a story in which everything's happening to the character. So your character needs to be making decisions and really acting upon them, even if the reader knows that the decisions that they're making aren't perhaps the best decisions. At least they're doing something, and that's going to incite a reaction in the reader as well, whether that's frustration that the character's deciding to do something that's not quite right, or a sense of support and camaraderie that they would have done the same thing. But yeah, have them really being reactive to things, and then also making decisions and just moving physically and emotionally in every way through the story. So you really get that character arc of change, internal and external, throughout the whole plot. I think that's really important. So flaws, agency. Oh yeah, and don't forget that they live in a bigger, broader world. So think about how they might interact with the different people in their lives. So they'll interact differently with their parents than they would, for example, with their best mate. So even their vocabulary might change a little bit when they're talking to their mum to when they're talking with their friends. So think about their voice, their vocabulary, their body language. I saw a couple of girls once walking up a hill not far from where I live. And it was before social distancing, so there was no reason why they couldn't be walking quite closely together. And they looked like they were really good friends, so you'd imagine that they'd be kind of huddled in a bit more. They're walking up a hill, and one of the girls was walking along, and she kind of had her sleeves pulled down over her hands, clutching them. And there was something about her, just that tiny little detail made her look like she was kind of a bit closed in on herself and not quite sure of herself, while her friend walked next to her but quite a bit away from her. So her friend, the one who was clutching her sleeves, was on the pavement, and then her friend was walking up the hill on the road, and it was a busy road and cars were having to move around her, and yet she didn't care, or she appeared like she didn't care. It was like she owned that road and she was going to walk on it. And I just thought it was really interesting that these two girls, who were quite clearly very good friends, were so different in the way they just walked up a street. And so tiny details like that about how they interact both with each other and with their immediate environment can be quite telling. So from that, I interpreted that the girl who had pulled her sleeves down over her hands was maybe a bit more timid, was in a situation perhaps where she wasn't quite so sure of herself, whereas her friend, who was just monopolising the road, had a lot more confidence and was kind of cocky with it. But I kind of admired her, even though it was quite dangerous. She shouldn't have been doing it. I thought, yeah, well, I'd love to have had that confidence when I was 16, 17, like she was. So yeah, just look for tiny details in other people's interactions and steal them for yourself, I think is quite good. What other things? Yeah, so words, what kind of words they might use in different situations. Think about their dialogue, as I said, when they're talking to different people. Whether, if they've got a real passion for something like art or science. So if somebody's really into art, they might use more visual language when they're describing things. So they might use a lot of colour. If they were into music, they might focus less on the visual and more on what they hear and what people's voices sound like. So really hone in, try and work out what your characters really like. Perhaps create. You both write, don't you? So I don't know whether you do this already, but when you first start off, just do a scatter diagram of all the little details that you can think of that might come into your head about these characters, and that might be their passions. And then from their passions, you work out whether that might influence their vocabulary, how they walk, how they wear, what they wear, how they spend their time, the kinds of people that they spend their time with. And so, yeah, everything, as soon as you start building those, a bit like Lego, I suppose, everything just gets bigger and bigger, and you start off with a tiny little Lego person, and gradually their worlds become bigger.
That's great. Tia, do you have anything to say on that?
I think that's great advice to like kind of hone in on like kind of your everyday person and kind of think like, why are they doing that, and like what are the events that led them up to that point? Because like I've seen like people who are like I think there was a few months ago, there's a case of there was a guy walking his cat on a lead kind of around, which is such like a peculiar thing to do because like it's a cat, it's not like a dog or anything. And just like it's like I'd love to like kind of write about like what made this man like stick this lead on a cat and they kind of bring around, and he did like repetitively like several days, so it wasn't just like a one-off.
Maybe he always really wanted a dog, but he wasn't allowed a dog, so he had to get a cat. So he just treats this poor cat as if it's a dog. But yeah, that's brilliant. That's such a perfect thing to note about somebody, and it tells you so much about them, or at least it gives you lots of ideas as to why they could be that way. So did you see him quite often?
Yeah, I'd see him like a bit kind of around town and stuff, and it always just be a bit kind of, I don't know how to phrase it other than like kind of it startles you because you're not like expecting it. Well, startle probably won't be the right word, but kind of, yeah. So the next question what are some tips and tricks that you use to make your characters more believable?
Okay, so I use a few things. So I still do think about star signs quite a lot, even though not a big believer in astrology. Although I say I'm not, but then I'm a Leo and I like to think of myself as a Leo. And then, recently there was a thing about how they said there are actually, is it 2 more star signs or at least 1 more? And everybody's star sign subsequently changed, and which perhaps proves it's nonsense. But anyway, I do quite like it. But it's really helpful for going online, and you can just get a whole character, a whole personality for one person on one site, and it will tell you who they might or might not be compatible with, what their character traits are. So that's a bit of a cheat. And then an extension of that is a book that I often use called The Wisdom of the Enneagram, which I was introduced to by another writer, Julie Cohen. And it offers 9 different personality types. And at the beginning, there is a quiz. So what I tend to do is when I first start writing a novel and just thinking of different characters, once I've got to the point where I've got kind of 5, my main character and then maybe 4 other characters who are going to play a really important role, I do the Enneagram quiz for each of them. And it's a personality quiz, and it tells you their personality type. And I try to make sure that each of those 4 or 5 characters has a different type, so that I've got different types of people working with and against each other within the story. And what's really great about this book in particular is that from that quiz you determine the personality type, and then it's got a whole long section. So for example, there's one of the type 9 is the peacemaker, and then it's got, it must be like 30 pages or something on the peacemaker. And it will tell you within that chapter, it gives you, let's see, I made a note of it so I could remind myself, the message that they will have received from whoever looked after them from when they were younger. So like that childhood message that we all hear, maybe not necessarily consciously. So for example, it's not okay to make mistakes. It's not okay to trust anyone or be vulnerable. And it's not okay to assert yourself, might be one of the messages that they would get. And that childhood message that we all receive will inevitably impact how we then behave as grown-ups. And what's really great, it will take that childhood message and it will give you examples of reasons why somebody might have heard that message, and then the way that that message exhibits itself in that character's behavior as a child and then both as an adult. And it also suggests their biggest fear. So some of the fears that are suggested are fear of being bad or unworthy, And knowing your character's deepest fear is really, really helpful, because if you know what they're fundamentally scared of, you can play that into every single, maybe not every single scene, but have it as an underlying thread, which will make them react and do things that, and like I said about giving them agency, it will really help them be bolder and broader characters and better drawn, I think. Also gives you their basic desire, which can be their driver for the book. So with every story, you really need the essence of what they're after. So like with The Sky Is Mine, I was saying Izzy wants to be heard, and that's the driver of the story. So it starts off and she's not listened to, and then by the end, she's speaking very clearly about what's happened to her. And there's all sorts of stuff that goes on in between, but the real essence and the thread that runs throughout is whether she's being listened to or not, and her desire to make herself heard. And so knowing these different character types and what that fear and desire might be is really helpful when you're really trying to get to the nugget of the story, so that you don't go off on too many tangents. So yeah, those two, the star signs and the wisdom of the Enneagram, both really good. And then I was watching an interview with David Nichols. I don't know if you know him, the author who wrote Black Swan Green. His newest one is Utopia, and he also wrote Cloud Atlas, which was adapted into a film. So really successful author. And he was saying what he does is write letters to himself from his characters. And I think he does this at the very beginning, so that he really gets to the heart of the character. And again, I suppose everything that I've been saying, what their fears are, their desire, so that when he's then coming to write them later, they already feel much more whole than if you're just starting off with a blank page. And I've never done that, but I think I'm a bit of a way off starting a new book. But I think when I do start a new one, I'm going to try that out, because it automatically puts you in their voice as well. And I always work really hard on my main character's voice, with all those things that we were saying about earlier, thinking about how the vocabulary they might use, etc. But with my peripheral characters, I don't think I work quite so hard on them. So it'd be interesting to write those letters, not just from my main character, but from the characters who surround them as well. Have you tried doing anything like that?
Personally, I don't write letters for my characters. I don't know, I just don't. But I do something similar, where like how you did with like the personality test, like the Enneagram. I use the Myers-Briggs test to like kind of plan my characters, I guess. So that like you so you can kind of see like, oh, would this kind of personality type kind of get along with this one, or like which kind of personality types like buddy up together kind of. Tara, would you do anything similar?
Whenever I write, I always listen to music to really put me in the mood. So if I'm writing a character specific chapter or anything, I make them their own playlist.
And do you listen while you're actually writing?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So like it puts me in the mood to like write I usually write in first person. I can never write in third person. So like it puts me in the mood to see how they'd think while listening to these songs, or like how the songs boost off of their personalities. And I also use star signs as well. I feel like star signs are very important, especially all the different types.
Yeah.
There's like moon rising, and then there's the whole planet. So like if you really like tone on someone's birthday and like the time they were born at, it really reflects. You can get a whole thing of how they deal with like relationships and how they deal with like their anger and stuff like that, just through like a chart.
Yeah.
Which is so great.
Do you use? I sometimes create Pinterest boards for them as well.
Yeah.
For clothes and party. If they've got a big event coming up, I like to do it. I mean, it feels like a massive distraction. It just feels like I'm cheating my way through my day, like I'm not actually writing. But I do think it all really helps, doesn't it? Because it's just building. It's like that Lego analogy again. It's just building everything up, and it becomes a bit more three-dimensional than just looking at a page. I also find as well that when you're when you're creating characters, and even when you've created them and they're in your book, it really helps to read. I read out loud everything I write anyway, but especially the dialogue. I think it's really helpful to read a scene out several times over, and because it can just be tiny little changes that you can make to dialogue to make it sound much more like authentic speech rather than just an author making somebody speak, if that makes sense. Because I think we can tend to make dialogue sound a bit more formal than it actually is. And while we wouldn't want to put in every little intonation and and ah and like and all those other little bits that we have it inevitably in our speech, I think to make it feel real, you do need a few of those quirks in there. They can get a bit annoying, and I have been criticised in The Sky Is Mine because I abbreviated Izzy shortens because to cause all the time, and that really pissed some people off. And some people said they didn't know what it meant. So I do think you have to be careful. But to me, that was just how she spoke, and so it felt more real to do that. So yeah, I'd really advise reading everything out loud, especially dialogue. And if you can bear it, asking a friend perhaps to read the dialogue out loud with you, like a table read, I think they call it, don't know, when they're doing scripts. But yeah, that can be really helpful, just because just taking out the odd word or abbreviating a word sometimes, or yeah, just changing the vocabulary slightly could make it a lot better.
The next question, would you ever use characteristics or mannerisms of yourself or people you know when writing characters in a similar sense? Do you write your characters based on yourself and your friends?
I try not to base them on people that I know, because I'm always petrified that somebody will see themselves if I did that and either be mortally offended or yeah, and then I might just end up annoying loads of people. So I might take the odd thing that they say or do, or a phrase that they use, or a little mannerism that they might have. But more often I tend to take things from something that I've read or overheard or listened to on a podcast or something. So with my first book, it got me an agent but didn't get me a deal. It's called We're All Made of Rubber. And I had the idea then, so I'd read a newspaper story years and years previously about a girl who fell 100 foot from a cliff and didn't break a single bone in her body. And that story just really stuck with me. And then about 8 years later, I had a guy at work who knew somebody whose child was desperate to break a world record, and was going around attempting all these crazy world records at home, from how many post-it notes he could get stick on his face, to pogo sticking around the garden like for hours and hours just to see how long he could do it for, see if he could get the record. And I thought those two things would be really nice to bring together. And the trait of somebody wanting to break a world record, I was thinking, well, what would give them that desire? And it became about sibling rivalry. So the sister, her older sister had fallen from a cliff and not broken a single bone in her body. And then Clem, because that was a story her parents always told people, Clem wanted her parents to have a story about her to tell. And so that's why she wanted to break a world record. So that would make her as unique as her sister. So when you hear something interesting in a newspaper story, or your friends chatting about people they know, just hold on to those tiny little details that you think might make quite quirky traits for your characters, because I think they can all work their way in, even if it's like 10 years later. And then there might be certain situations where I might take something from real life. So when I was writing The Sky Is Mine, I was telling a group of adults about it, and I was saying, oh, it's an exploration of rape culture and domestic abuse. And then, because that always sounds a bit dark, I was like, oh, but it does have a happy ending. And then one of the guys in the group said, oh, why does the man get what he wants in the end? And that was his joke. And some people in the group found that funny. I found it really offensive. Kind of goes against everything the whole book is about. And it was really interesting to watch the dynamic in the group and see how some people clearly felt uncomfortable but still felt obliged to laugh, how other people just kept a very straight face but still didn't say anything. And then I did say something, but I don't think I would have done before I'd written the book. And so situations like that, where there's a definite split in the room, it can be helpful to look around and see everybody's different reactions and make a mental note of those, because it's when things get awkward that people's real character traits can show themselves. And so, yeah, everything's material basically. So even when people say really crappy things, there'll be something in there hopefully that you can use for the future. So yeah, just constantly mine details and information, things people say, their body reactions, everything. Yeah, it can all count. And then you asked about whether I write from my own experience as well. And I wouldn't have said, I heard a really good quote earlier, actually. I wrote it down. So I was listening to a podcast, I don't know if you listened to it, called You're Wrong About. Have you heard of it? And it's two presenters, and they take a subject that we all think we know something about, and they kind of do a deep dive into it. So they're both journalists, and they're investigating factual stories, but obviously facts can always be debated as well. And one of the presenters said about what they do as journalists, it's us displaying a part of ourselves while playing a pantomime that we're telling a factual story. And I just thought that was really interesting, because I think that's what we're doing. Certainly what I have found that I do with novels as well. Like, I think I'm telling a fictional story, but actually in everything that I'm revealing something about myself as well. But quite often I don't know what it is I'm revealing about myself until after I've written a whole book. And so for The Sky Is Mine, as I said, it's all about Izzy wanting to find her own voice and to be heard. And it was only in writing some of this today, actually, that I put two and two together. And at the time that I wrote The Sky Is Mine, I was moving house reluctantly. I didn't want to move. We were moving from about 300 miles across the country, and I didn't want to do the move, but I did. But I didn't feel like I was being heard. And then I started writing a book about a girl who's not heard. And the reasons we weren't being heard and the things that we were trying to say were all really different. But that essence, the nugget that I was talking about earlier, that was the same. And then with the book that I'm writing now, it's all about grief. And I hadn't lost anybody. But then in researching grief and writing a lot about grief, I realised that I was grieving the place where I used to live. And so I'm not writing autobiographically at all, because the things that are happening to my characters aren't happening to me. But that universe, I suppose it is, like we were saying earlier about finding that universal feeling that creates empathy in a character. That's what I've been doing in my books. So I've found the feeling that's in me, the thing that's bothering me most at the time, and then putting it into somebody else and channeling all my own fear, resentment, fury, happiness too. I'm not like a big ball of misery, but all of those feelings that I have about a very different situation, I'm putting that into theirs. So yeah, I guess I am using my life experience, but not explicitly and not in a way that would be immediately obvious, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah, I'm very similar to you, where when I write characters, they're in very horrible situations that I have never been in personally, but there's small bits about them that are like me.
Yeah. And
like,
do you recognise that at the time?
Yeah. Sometimes I don't, but sometimes I do. Like this one character that I'm writing, Athena, she's going through a horrible domestic and just abuse. Everything's going wrong in her life, but there's like small things that she does that I do that I didn't even realize. Like something that she does is whenever she goes to a beach, she picks up rocks. And I do that, but before even writing it, I didn't even realize that was what I do. And I just put that in without even realizing.
Yeah. What do you do with the rocks? Do you take them?
I have a big jar. I have a big jar of just rocks that I just keep.
Do you ever take them out of the jar, or once they're in, they're in?
They're in. There's stuff there then.
What about you, Tia?
I would do something similar, where I'd take like kind of parts of me and then like exaggerate them, or like take parts that I know and kind of exaggerate them and kind of place them into my characters. Obviously not in like a completely negative way. Like I'm writing something, and I have a friend whose humor is very dry and quite like sarcastic, and I kind of took that kind of part and put it into my character because I really like that kind of feeling.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, I'm like, it's also because I've seen like a lot of shows and like movies where they have like a character do a kind of specific thing, and then like that becomes their thing. Like an example of this would be this anime called Death Note. One of the characters in it often he kind of sits kind of perched up with his like knees tucked underneath him, and like he eats sweets a lot, and that's just something that I think is like is quite it's quite interesting because like I think everyone has their own kind of little thing that they do, and it's their thing. Like if somebody like I don't know shaves their eyebrows every month, or like if somebody is just like kind of they do something and they're not like trying to hide it or anything. I think that's kind of effective in like in kind of bringing your characters into a more kind of realistic approach.
Yeah.
Tara, do you want to move on to the next question?
Yeah, the final question is, who out of all the characters you've written, who was your favorite character and why?
Oh, see, this is a really hard question. Izzy's probably the most well-rounded because she's been edited really well, I'd say. So I do really love Izzy, and I love the journey she goes on, and I love the fact that she does find the power in her own voice. But I think I'll always have a really soft spot for Clem, who's the one who wanted to break a world record. I really loved her best friends. I always really loved their best friends. All my protagonists have great best friends, and I find the best friends much easier to write. And I don't quite know why that is. I don't know whether it's because I feel less pressured about them to get everything right, and because of that, I'm just a bit freer with them, so it comes a bit more naturally. But yeah, I really, really like Clem. She was really good fun for all her like neuroticism and obsession with world records. She shared a few of my own obsessions as well. Like I really love Dolly Parton, and I did become a bit obsessed with world records while I was writing her. And consequently, as part of research, I got a world record. So I became the fastest woman in the world on a space hopper over a mile. And so I'll always love Clem for like pushing me to do that, because it's quite a nice thing to be able to say that I've done. And but I need to check that I still hold it. Somebody may have beaten me, which means I might need to get back on my space hopper. So yeah, and because she was my first book as well, I wrote her with such, what's the word? I don't know, like a certain amount of naivety as to how hard it is to get published and to keep going. And so there was so much passion there at the beginning that hadn't been hampered by rejection. So she was just so fresh and lovely and exciting. So yeah, I do really love her. And then, but it's funny because, like I say, the characters who I really like, some of them are the best friends, and quite often the ones who I really like get cut as well. So there's a character called Connie, who's a woman in her 70s who was originally in The Sky Is Mine. She was cut from that. And then she was in an adult book that I'm working on. She's been cut from that. But she's got her story. I know she has a story of her own, but I wonder whether maybe I keep trying to put her in these other people's stories, and actually she's a book in her own right. And so when you're editing, if you do have to cut characters, although it can feel really brutal, just hold on to them, like keep them safe somewhere, and they'll come back in at some point. So the same with your work with scenes and everything. Don't worry about cutting. Like be as brutal as you can. There's that phrase, kill your darlings. Even the most loveliest of scenes, sometimes if they're not working, just cut, but never delete them entirely. Have a file with all your lovely edited bits, and someday they might come back and save you or create a story of their own. So yeah, I'd say probably Clem is my favourite character, but nobody will ever read her because I didn't get a deal. So poor Clem.
So do you want to read an excerpt of your work now?
Yeah. So I'll read a short chapter. It's the second chapter in The Sky Is Mine. So to put it in context, Izzy's been at a party where a guy from her college has abused her, and this is a few weeks after, but he's passed some photographs around school, so everybody kind of knows a little bit about what happened at the party, and she's at college now in a lesson. It's not the first time someone slipped me a pair of inflated tits under the table. And even though Miss Green's onto him, I'm pretty sure it won't be the last time Jacob pulls up some hardcore on his phone and passes it round the class like a tin of Quality Street at Christmas. And if it weren't for his juiced up excitement, I could hand it straight back. But there's this film of sweat from Jacob's palms. And what with that and the shock of that mesh of bodies going at it like hairless animals in a screen-sized cage in a zoo, the phone falls to the floor in an all eyes on me kind of clatter. And Jacob rolls his eyes like, oh, seriously, Izzy, as if I'm the idiot here. And it's stupid, really, how I can look at the phone as I pick it up, but not at Jacob as I put it down on the desk. How his hard stare makes me feel as naked as those women in the film. Honestly, you lot. Miss Green doesn't clock Callum Gunn's hands, miming just what he'd like to do to her bum as she walks from the whiteboard towards me. How many times have you been told? No phones in class. Sorry, miss. Though Jacob's voice is a sorry, not sorry kind of smirk, as Miss Green picks it up, turns it over, and sees the massive skin, the wet mouths, and the perfectly timed shot of the man getting just what he came for. I'll delete it, miss, he says. But we all know that if he does, there are 1,000 more where that came from. Those films he called life lessons, when I saw him watching one on the bus a few months back. And he did that V-shaped thing with his fingers, tongue between them, the other boys sniggering, and yeah, some of the girls too. Come on, miss, he says now. It's a laugh, isn't it? But Miss Green, the inside of her bottom lip pulled back between her teeth, doesn't look like she thinks that's true. Don't be a prude, miss. It's just bodies. He winks. Natural, isn't it? I catch Grace's eye like, say something. Ask Izzy, miss, Jacob mutters. I swear my face melts into my body, melts into the floor. Only it doesn't, not really. There's too much of me, too many inches of thick shame to disappear. And though Grace's hand on my thigh is an anchor, it's not enough to steady the shake, which starts in my fingers but spreads like gossip through the college corridors to the rest of me. Because though the click of Miss Green's heels on the floor might have prevented her from hearing Jacob's jibe about me, the rest of the class received it loud and clear. Not that it's anything new, because, no kidding, it's 5 weeks since that's party, and Jacob's still getting off on how easily I shrivel when he's around. Watch yourself, Mansfield. If Jacob's voice was a sorry, not sorry, Grace's is a you will be. His shoulders are like, whatever, as he stands, all that 6'2" of him, following Miss Green to the front of the classroom, where he leans over her desk, and in that voice, deep as hell since 3 or so years ago, when he and his mates hulked from boy body to man body, he apologises, just sincere enough this time. Miss Green tells him, any more of that, and honestly, Jacob, I'll have no choice. Thanks, miss, he says, head down as he turns away from her, slipping the phone into his pocket, where he makes a pantomime grab of his dick. He mouths in my direction, you love it. Maxdale shakes his head like, you nod, Mansfield. But he's smiling. Everyone's smiling, right? Because it's natural, isn't it? Anything else, and you're just a prude. So I thought I'd read that bit because there's not a ton of dialogue in there. But I thought it was quite a good piece to show with both short pieces of dialogue and interaction, like I was talking about earlier, and physical reactions as well as verbal ones, the different characters. And so Jacob is obviously got a lot, he's really cocky, got a lot of confidence around a teacher. Izzy shrinks in his presence, and even though he's really obnoxious and the teacher's aware of what a knob he's being, she's kind of controlling the class, tempering it down. But behind her back, he's still got a nerve to be quite sexual in front of the rest of the class. And then Izzy's turning to Grace, just looking at her, like say something, shows that in her silence, she's at least got somebody who she thinks that she can turn to. And Grace is the opposite of Izzy, in that she is able to stand up to Jacob, even though it's just one line where she says, "Watch yourself, Mansfield." Just that one line shows that she's got a lot more confidence than perhaps Grace has, than Izzy has. And yeah, so the interaction, the body language, all of that, I think if you can really hone in on a scene and look at the minute detail, like we were saying earlier, it can really help create the atmosphere as well as the dialogue, etc. And then if you want, I can read a short bit later as well, which I thought might show a little bit of contrast. If we've got time, do you want me to read a shorter bit from later?
Sure.
Yeah. So it's just when Izzy starts to gain a bit of confidence, it shows a bit of a lighter side. So it's quite good if you can see. Voice for me was really important because the book was all about finding voice. I wanted to see a change in Izzy's voice throughout the whole in her arc. And so this is a bit where she meets Harry, a boy, a bit later in the novel, and they're going out on a bit of a date. They're going canoeing. You grab that end. But this is huge. It's got to be for 2 people, right? Can't I go out on my own? You're kidding. You know how much trouble I'd get into if I let a novice out on a single. Sorry, but this morning you're stuck in a double with me. And he actually winks, like proper shuts his left eye, cocks his head and makes that weird clicking sound people who wink make when they're actually winking. Can you not? Can I not what? Wink. And he winks again. What? Harry's voice is an oar in the water, stirring things up. You don't like that? So he does it again, obviously, and again, and then all the way down to the jetty, which is good, really, because maybe if he'd got one eye closed most of the way, he'll be less likely to notice how puffed I am just lugging the bloody thing, and I haven't even started rowing yet. It's sculling, actually, Harry says when I ask when he first started rowing. Huh? What we're doing? It's sculling. Oh, that's what we're doing, is it? Sculling. What else would we be doing, Izzy? And he can't help it, can he? He winks again, silently this time, with this giant grin across his face, which I know he'd say isn't as cute as Harry Styles, but nothing. Like you said, we're just sculling. I'm glad for the fact that my back's to him as I climb into the boat. It makes me bolder, I guess. Definitely not flirting. Oh, God, no, Harry says, his voice like those lines people get around their eyes when they smile. Definitely not that, and definitely not wondering whether you're single. No, that'd be awful, right? But I am, even though you're definitely not wondering. I am single, I mean.
All right, so we want to say thank you to Amy for being here. Thank you very much. We hope everyone enjoyed that beautiful interview. I'm Tara and Tia as well. And another big thank you just from the entire committee of the Lit. So thank you all for watching.